Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming on what almost feels like the first day of spring in Greencastle. Nice thaw today. Appreciate you being here for tonight's conversation on Freedom Summer Revisited, led by Professor Emeritus of History at DePauw, John Dittmer. Tonight's conversation is part of DePauw's Virtual Alumni College, a new series of webinars connecting alumni with DePauw professors on a monthly basis. And for those of you who are watching online, a little bit of context. We're gathered on campus in the Watson Forum of the Pulliam Center. We have a nice gathering of students, faculty, staff, and members of the Greencastle community. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dittmer, who began his academic career teaching at Tougaloo College, a historically black college in Mississippi, teaching there from 1967 to 1979. He was a visiting professor at Brown and MIT in the early 80s before coming to DePauw in 1985 as chair of the history department. Taught at DePauw for 17 years before retiring from his teaching obligations in 2002. But during that time, he earned the Tucker Award for Career Achievement, the Exemplary Teaching Award, also took honorary degrees from both DePauw and Tougaloo. Of course, Dr. Dittmer is an award-winning scholar and author. His first book was Black Georgia in the Progressive Era, followed by Local People, the Struggle for Civil Rights in Mississippi, which, of course, was awarded the Bancroft Prize and the Lillian Smith Book Award. His latest book is The Good Doctors, the Medical Committee for Human Rights and the Politics of Healthcare in America. Along with two professors right now at the Fannie Lou Hamer Institute, he is working on a book on Freedom Summer, which will be published in the Bedford St. Martin's documentary history series. DePauw alumni are so fortunate to have inspired professors like Dr. Dittmer who change alumni lives and really change the way we look at the world. And as one of those students myself, former student of Dr. Dittmer, it's really an honor to introduce Dr. Dittmer tonight. So, Dr. Dittmer. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Steve.
Yep.
Good evening. For those of you here and those of you out there on the web, it was really interesting. Steve showed me the list of people who were signing up for this, and it's probably the most diverse audience geographically and age-wise that I have spoken to. DePauw graduates from all over the country, a number of history majors, people I remember very fondly. But there's only one person I'm going to mention tonight, and I didn't teach him. His name is Bill Allison. Now, Bill was a DePauw graduate. He did very well. He was a vice president of Coca-Cola, and he also served on the DePauw Board of Trustees. But pertinent to our mission tonight, it should be pointed out that Bill was a member of the class of 1954 and the only African-American student in that class, one of 4 in the university. So we're going to say a lot of things about Mississippi tonight and about how backward it was during those times. I think in doing so, we better keep our eye on our own situation as well, because race relations were certainly not something that were only deteriorating in the South. We had our share of problems too, and still do. This was the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer, and I'd like to begin with a comment on the Summer Project by a leading black nationalist. In many ways, the Mississippi Summer Project was a turning point for a whole generation of us. It was certainly the boldest, most dramatic, and traumatic single event of the entire movement. It certainly had the most far-reaching effect for national party politics, for the activist college generation, for the state of Mississippi and the movement there. After the summer, none of these would be the same. And the person who wrote these words was Stokely Carmichael, also known as Kwame Ture, in his book, Ready for Revolution. In 1964, Yes, upwards of 1,000 volunteers came to Mississippi in the summer of 1964 to do voter registration work, to teach in the freedom schools, to work in the community centers, and to register people for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. There are anniversary commemorations planned all over for this year. The biggest will be the last week of June in Jackson, Mississippi, where you'll have hundreds of volunteers and activists who are coming there to commemorate the occasion. There are others closer to home. Earlham is going to have a one-day conference on April 5th about 1964, and Freedom Summer will be featured. Barbara Ransby, who is a leading historian of the movement in Chicago, is putting together what looks like an excellent conference May 28th to May 30th. A number of notables are going to be there, including Julian Bond. Those of you in the Chicago area might want to put that on your calendar. And then there will be a PBS documentary on the American experience on Freedom Summer by Stanley Nelson. Some of you may be familiar with his work with his documentary on the Freedom Rides, which was shown about 3 years ago. This will be shown on PBS on June 24th. And since anniversaries are in vogue, this will also be the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, and the IU Law School in Bloomington is planning a series of programs this fall. Now, I've been a consultant for 3 documentaries on Freedom Summer, and they've all shared a common problem, and that is that the volunteers, who are mostly white college students, get most of the attention rather than the local activists who'd been risking their lives for years. Unfortunately, I'll be making some of the same error tonight. There is simply not enough time, as the documentary makers always told me, to adequately discuss the important events that took place prior to Freedom Summer. There are books that tell that story in detail, one of which I would particularly recommend. The movement in Mississippi took place, of course, during the age of racial segregation. For a century after the war, blacks there had been doing the same kind of work they did during slavery. 80% of the black men were working in fields, mostly as sharecroppers. The majority of working women were maids and cooks. Most, however, lived on plantations in dilapidated shacks with no indoor toilets or running water. And of course, this was the age of Jim Crow, with all aspects of life segregated: schools, theaters, libraries, parks, even drinking fountains. In my book, I begin my story of what I think the modern civil rights movement is at the end of World War II, with veterans like Medgar Evers and Amzie Moore and Aaron Henry determined that they didn't win the battle against Nazi racism only to tolerate the Mississippi version when they returned home. For the next 15 years, they struggled unsuccessfully to build a movement. This is the Cliff Notes version for you. The white opposition was united and, if necessary, violent, and the administrations of Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower adopted a hands-off the South policy for the most part, which would be followed to a great extent by their successor, John Kennedy. The same could be said for the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, who would use his COINTEL program to go after civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King. Now, the Brown decision of '54 declared segregated schools unconstitutional. It didn't integrate any schools in Mississippi for the next decade, but it gave rise to the citizens' councils, that uptown Ku Klux Klan of lawyers, businessmen, the respectable citizens of the town that had at its major purpose preserving white supremacy in the Magnolia State. The 1960s began with the sit-in movement, which spread across the Upper South, and a year later there were the Freedom Rides, led by James Farmer of the Congress of Racial Equality, where hundreds of Freedom Riders did time in Mississippi's notorious Parchman Penitentiary. And a new organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was formed. And I think we should slow down a bit here because SNCC, as it was called, was the most important single organization in Mississippi, and I think one of the most interesting of all. Rather than follow the example of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which relied on the charismatic presence of Martin Luther King to lead direct action protests, from the outset, SNCC encouraged local people to participate in the planning and execution of all their programs. And where historically leadership in the Negro community, as it was known then, had fallen on a handful of influential preachers and other professionals, SNCC sought out maids, sharecroppers, independent farmers, and small business entrepreneurs, developing new leaders whose allegiance was to the black masses for whom they spoke. One of the leading SNCC activists in Mississippi was Bob Moses, a New York school teacher who became a legendary figure in the civil rights movement. He and other SNCC workers there met with leaders of other organizations working in the state, SCLC, CORE, the state and local NAACP and local organizations, and they formed an organization called COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations. Now, this was an umbrella agency, and in Mississippi was the only state where you had all the organizations working together under the same banner. In so doing, they avoided all of the infrastructure of the party fighting that was taking place in other states. It was simply too dangerous in Mississippi for the groups to be going at each other's throats. SNCC first launched a voter registration campaign in Macomb in southwest Mississippi in the summer and fall of 1961, but they were driven out by hostile white police, elected officials, and citizens who resorted to violence, including murder, to maintain the status quo. I had like 5 more minutes on Macomb. It's very important. I would recommend a Hollywood movie to you. It's called Freedom Song, and it's available on Netflix. And it is really the story, very well told, of the Macomb movement in 1960. It has Danny Glover as the star and a number of other actors that would be familiar to you. It's of all the civil rights movies, this is the one that the activists feel is the most accurate. SNCC then moved on up to the Mississippi Delta, launching a campaign in Greenwood, led at first by 2 young black Mississippians, Sam Block and Willie Peacock. And it was in Greenwood that things really got started the way SNCC was going. These guys went in. Greenwood was a town that was overwhelmingly black, but the white leadership, very hostile to any kind of civil rights activity. When they walked into the city, people didn't want to have anything to do with them. But they stuck with it. They gradually were there going to pool halls and beauty parlors, asking people what their problems were. And maybe they could be solved if we got the vote. We're a majority here. And I mention this because it was also in Greenwood that another development took place that was very important to SNCC and the movement, and that is they attracted young people to their cause, like June Johnson. And these young people often brought their whole families into the movement. And beginning with the Delta movement, women entered the campaign in large numbers, participating in all phases of activity. Historian Charles Payne found that, quote, in the Delta, in the rural South generally, women were in fact much more politically active than men. Now, part of the reason for this phenomenon was that SNCC was looking for non-traditional leadership, and women represented an enormous pool of untapped potential. Think of people like Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer. 1963 was an important year for the black freedom struggle. In Birmingham, most of you recall seeing the pictures of the police dogs attacking children, and later the 4 young girls who died in a Birmingham church bombing. There was the March on Washington and King's I Have a Dream. In Mississippi, the news was mostly not so encouraging. After a promising start, the Greenwood movement declined. Once whites realized that the Kennedy administration was not going to protect blacks exercising their constitutional rights, police and white supremacists terrorized and intimidated black local people. SNCC stayed there, but they weren't making that much progress. Down in Jackson, the promising movement there was stopped in its tracks after the assassination of Medgar Evers, the state's most prominent activist. During that same week that Medgar was killed, a group of black women were returning from a SCLC leadership conference in South Carolina when they decided to integrate the white waiting room at the Trailway Station in the small town of Winona, Mississippi. For this, they were arrested, thrown in jail, and brutally beaten. One of these women, Fannie Lou Hamer, would tell her story to a national television audience only a year later. In Clarksdale, where Aaron Henry, the head of the NAACP, had built a broad-based local movement, whites simply drew the line, refused to negotiate any of the black demands, and kept the jails full of demonstrators. The same held true then in projects across the state. Well, determined to keep their movement alive, black activists concluded that a dramatic change in tactics was necessary. They'd been doing small one-on-one organizing, building up indigenous leadership, and now these people were being picked off. The new strategy took place in the summer of 1963 with a COFO decision to hold a statewide mock election, culminating a year later with the challenge of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party at the Democratic National Convention, challenging the regular all-white segregationist party. Now, the freedom vote was held in '63 for several reasons. Whites were saying, you know, you don't have many black voters because they don't want to vote. They're apathetic. Well, this was a chance to show that if given the opportunity, blacks could vote. And also that it would spread the movement into areas where it had not been before. During that campaign, a group of white students from Yale and Stanford spent 2 weeks in Mississippi getting out the vote. Their presence was duly noted. 3 weeks after the freedom vote, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Although movement activists knew that Kennedy was no civil rights hero, they mourned his death and were apprehensive about his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, a Southerner. In the days and weeks following the assassination, civil rights activity declined across the South. In Mississippi, COFO leaders were facing a dilemma. Should they return to low-key grassroots organizing in individual communities or build on the foundation laid by the freedom vote and initiate another ambitious statewide campaign? White supremacists in Mississippi were also rethinking their strategy. The White Citizens Council had been the leading racist organization since its founding in 1954. But in 1963, extremists, believing the Citizens Council had not done its job because the civil rights people were still there, formed a new old organization, the Ku Klux Klan, which rapidly spread across the state. Throughout the winter and spring of 1965, night riders roamed the state. On a single night in May, the Klan burned crosses in 64 counties. Black homes, businesses, and churches were bombed and burned. White Mississippi officials and police did nothing to deter the violence. In some cases, as we learned later, the police were the Klan. And President Lyndon Johnson appeared to be following the same hands-off policy as has had his martyred predecessor. So this new threat led a sense of urgency to the ongoing discussions in COFO. With the Klan running wild, how could COFO persuade local people to come to a meeting, much less go to the courthouse and in full view of the public try to register to vote? Why not do something really dramatic, like inviting not 100, but 1,000 college students to spend their summers working in Mississippi? Now that proposal led to a long debate inside COFO. Now the idea of the summer project wasn't that controversial, but bringing down a large number of white college students was. In fact, most SNCC field secretaries were opposed. An expanded white presence, they argued, would divert resources away from the primary mission of organizing and empowering black communities. Putting white faces in black neighborhoods would increase the likelihood of Klan violence, particularly if white female volunteers were seen with black men. Moreover, with the confidence that came with money and education, students from elitist universities could intimidate and embarrass local people. For example, you think of a black woman sitting in an office with a hunt and peck typing maybe 10 words a minute, and this volunteer from the north comes down. I can type 80 words a minute, shoves her aside, and then she does it well, very well, but what is the result of that? That was the sort of fear, that people who were being built up as local leaders might be intimidated by people who were trying to do the right thing, but were causing more trouble than good. However, there were important people on the side of bringing in the idea, including Bob Moses, Dave Dennis, who was the head of the CORE project in the state, and interestingly, local black Mississippians who were not full-time civil rights workers, including Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, who argued at a heated COFO meeting in November that, quote, if we're trying to break down this barrier of segregation, we can't segregate ourselves. The major argument, however, was pragmatic. Unless America awakened to what was going down in the Magnolia State, white Mississippians would continue to employ terrorist tactics to destroy the movement. And so long as it was black people who were being brutalized, white Americans paid little attention. White students, on the other hand, would bring with them visibility and publicity, and their presence might force a reluctant federal government to protect them and other civil rights workers in the exercise of their constitutional rights. That argument eventually carried the day, and in early 1964, COFO began recruiting volunteers, mostly on Northern College campuses. In mid-June, orientation sessions were held at Western College for Women in Oxford, Ohio. Forgot to say that there'll be another commemoration in Oxford, Ohio this fall, featuring the people who were doing the training there. The first session was for people who were going to work on voter registration in Mississippi, and the second week would go for people who were going to teach in the freedom schools, which I'll talk about shortly. 250 volunteers attended the first session, and some 300 young people arrived a week later. They would be joined by other college students who couldn't make the either session, and by volunteer lawyers, doctors, nurses, and social workers. There may have been close to 1,000 volunteers in Mississippi during the summer, but probably no more than 600 at any one time. More than 40% of the applicants were women. A disproportionate number of the volunteers were attending elite schools like Harvard and Stanford. Blacks made up only about 10% of the volunteer contingent. Now, several factors account for this. Colleges were the major recruiting ground, and only 3% of all undergraduates were black at the time. Moreover, as it was argued, most blacks needed to work during the summers to finance their education and couldn't take time off. But some northern blacks were no doubt deterred by their parents, many of them who knew Southern racism firsthand and did not want to put their children in harm's way. We were in the South. We got out of there. We don't want you to go back. Throughout the week, volunteers heard from a steady stream of civil rights notables, including Bayard Rustin and Vincent Harding. They also listened to John Doerr, the Justice Department official most involved in civil rights. Now, Doerr had been to Mississippi many times and had demonstrated both understanding and courage. He was the only Justice Department official who gave SNCC people his home telephone to call him at any time of the day or the night. Yet his message to the volunteers was one that was handed down from the administration, and that is that they should expect no federal protection, that, quote, maintaining law and order is a state responsibility. The federal government, it appeared, would not be on their side in Mississippi. Justice Department officials, FBI officials would be there as they had been in the past, standing by taking notes while people were beaten up. On Saturday, June 20th, the first group of volunteers boarded buses and cars to make the long trip to the Magnolia State. It was, one volunteer noted, a strange combination of children headed for summer camp and soldiers going off to war. One of the volunteers, New Yorker Andy Goodman, rode down with the movement veterans Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney. Their destination was the relatively safe CORE project in Meridian. The next day, a second group of volunteers arrived in Oxford, those who were to teach in the freedom schools. On Monday morning, Bob Moses received word that 3 civil rights workers had been missing for 24 hours, and he called the volunteers to tell them the news. The disappearance of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman had a sobering effect on both the volunteers and on the COFO staff. One volunteer recalled that the mood on the campus was, quote, like a funeral parlor. SNCC activist Judy Richardson noted that each morning Bob Moses walked, quote, slowly to the backboard on the stage in the auditorium and without saying a word wrote, "The three are still missing." Just those words, nothing else. At the end of the week, before the volunteers boarded the buses, Moses told them that he had concluded that the kids are dead. I see this as a teachable moment for undergraduates. When I was talking about this particular event, asking students to put themselves in this position. Other than your family, what would you be risking your life for? I mean, they knew that three of their brothers had been killed. They assumed that. You would expect that maybe a lot of them would change their mind. Only a handful, despite a lot of calls from parents saying, get the hell out of there. Only a handful decided not to go to Mississippi, and they continued on their way. White Mississippians persuaded themselves that the whole story of the missing rights workers was a hoax. Senator James Eastland called it a publicity stunt. Others speculated that the three were in Cuba enjoying the hospitality of Fidel Castro. 2 days after their disappearance, FBI agents searching the area found the badly burned blue Ford station wagon owned by Mickey Schwerner. Locals were still not convinced. COFO must have burned their own car to make the hoax look convincing. Under pressure, President Lyndon Johnson persuaded FBI Director Hoover to beef up the agency's presence in Mississippi and sent former CIA Director Allen Dulles to Jackson to investigate. Well, as the nation's attention focused on Neshoba County, and if the movement wanted attention, they certainly got it all over the world, the summer project got underway. Volunteers moved into each of the 32 COFO projects scattered across the state. Many of the older volunteers, as I noted, were lawyers and doctors. There were few black attorneys and physicians in Mississippi, and with the influx of so many new people, additional resources were needed. A group of New York healthcare workers sent down 100 trained people under the banner of the Medical Committee for Human Rights, and several lawyers' organizations were represented, including the Leftist Lawyers Guild. For many white Mississippians, the influx of hundreds of integrationists constituted an invasion. The word was always used, an invasion that had to be repelled. During its opening session, the state legislature passed a series of laws banning picketing and leafleting while doubling the size of the state police. Jackson's Mayor Allen Thompson also greatly increased the size of his force, bought 200 shotguns and ordered 50 more, converted 2 city trucks into troop carriers, and purchased a combat vehicle, which became known as Thompson's Tank, that carried 10 officers and 2 drivers with shotguns protruding from gun ports. Now this was to meet this invasion of college kids. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some whites were convinced, for example, that black men sporting white bandages around their necks had been designated to rape white women. Sales of guns, ammunition, and Klan memberships boomed. Well, given this level of paranoia, it's not surprising that the summer of '64 was the most violent in Mississippi since Reconstruction. All told, before the summer ended, there were at least 6 racial murders, 35 shooting incidents, 65 homes and other buildings bombed, including 35 churches. 1,000 movement people were arrested, and 80 activists suffered beatings. Most of the physical violence, however, was directed against local blacks and veteran civil rights activists. The volunteers stayed with local black families, paying them a modest $10 a week for room and board. In addition to providing food and lodging, their host took a personal interest in the health and safety of their guests. Now, these families, I think, were the unsung heroes of the movement. The summer project could not have gotten off the ground without them. And they knew that they risked retaliation from local whites for housing these folks. As volunteer and author Tracy Sugarman put it, quote, Everybody knew that we were going home at the end of the summer, that people that took us in were going to stay. So they were there for the reprisals, for the anger that the white community had to bring to bear on them. And they did it because they believed that we were really there to help. I was on the advisory board. They're building a new civil rights museum in Jackson, Mississippi. And one of the suggestions was that they put the names of all the civil rights workers up in the middle so that they could be honored. And I said, well, do that only if you have the name of every black family that took in a white volunteer in the summer of '64, because they ran risks that a lot of people did not, whose names were up there. The new recruits were put to work immediately in all the projects. Some volunteers worked in community centers, many of which contained libraries donated by Northern supporters. And then there were the freedom schools. Number of teachers in the audience here tonight and in the web audience, and I always, when I talk to teachers, particularly community college teachers in the last couple of years, I always talk a lot about the freedom schools, and begin by talking about the public school system in Mississippi was a disgrace, in part because the state, the poorest in the Union, maintained two different school systems. And under the doctrine of separate but equal, white children were the beneficiaries of what meager funds were available to support the schools. The state spent 4 times as much on white schools as black, and the needs of white students took priority. Their school was nearly 2 months longer. Black kids in the fall had to go out and pick cotton. Their buildings were better. They had libraries. Most black schools did not. And they received free bus transportation. In many areas, Negro students had to pay $3 a month to ride the bus. So it's not surprising then that as late as 1950, 7 blacks in 10 had less than a 7th grade education, and only 2.3% had graduated from high school. Because all of the schools, black and white, were directly under the control of white school boards, black teachers knew they had to toe the line on matters racial or risk losing their jobs. In most school districts, African American history and contemporary race relations were taboo subjects. I should point out that movement people always talk about there was one teacher in their school who defied all this and who really told them about citizenship and what they could do. But these people were risking losing their jobs. So the organizers of the freedom schools knew their major responsibility was, quote, to fill an artistic and creative vacuum in the lives of Negro Mississippians and to get them to articulate their own desires, demands, and questions. The curriculum included remedial work in traditional subjects like reading, writing, and math, but it also included a variety of specialized classes in such areas as foreign language, science, dance, and debate, depending on the interests and expertise of the teacher. Under the heading of leadership development, each school offered a series of courses on the history and philosophy of the civil rights movement, current events, and Negro history. Most of the teachers were white women. Part of this was stereotypical. Teaching was women's work. Freedom Summer organizers were concerned about the safety of these women volunteers, and the Freedom School was quite frankly not as dangerous a place to work as on a plantation doing voter registration work with sharecroppers. The college volunteers usually had no teaching experience. There were, however, a good number of classroom teachers who had decided to spend their summer in Mississippi, and they taught as well. The Freedom Schools caught the imagination of the local people, where the original proposal envisioned about 25 schools serving approximately 1,000 10th and 11th graders. By summer's end, upwards of 2,500 students, ranging in age from preschool to senior citizens, were attending some 40 schools across the state. In sum, the Freedom Schools opened up a new world to several thousand black youngsters, enhancing their self-esteem and raising their expectations. The Freedom Schools stand out as one of the summer's major achievements. I can testify to that. We came to teach at Tougaloo in 1967, 3 years after the Freedom Schools, and I could tell immediately which of my students had been in the Freedom Schools, because they were much more comfortable with discussion rather than simply sitting down and listening to what the teacher said. They were even willing to challenge you more. And they were not intimidated by white teachers, as a lot of students at Tougaloo who were seeing their first white classroom teacher found it to be. Generally, the summer volunteers were quite successful as Freedom School teachers, but outside the classroom there were some problems. The reservations expressed by a number of SNCC field secretaries in the spring that volunteers from prestigious northern universities, arrogant, confident, and naive, would come down and try to assume leadership positions were borne out in a few cases. And I list several of these in my book, where whites later on, reflecting back on what they were doing, realized that they were trying to take over. But these were not the majority. A concern in some of the projects was interracial sex, particularly relationships that developed between black male civil rights workers and white women volunteers. Local blacks frowned on this behavior, black women resented it, and segregationists became enraged at the mere sighting of an interracial couple. These liaisons could create serious problems, and project directors tried to discourage them. As Ivanhoe Donaldson put it, such activity would, quote, provide local whites with the initiative they need to come here and kill all of us. I think the extent of sexual activity between blacks and whites during Freedom Summer has been exaggerated, in part because white supremacists had made it a centerpiece of their attack on the summer project itself. Still, in a number of projects, some white women volunteers did have sex with black males who at times came on aggressively. White SNCC worker Mary King, who was in Mississippi that summer, later wrote that, quote, sexual dalliances were one way for a volunteer to prove that she was not racist, and I'm sure any number of black men manipulated this anxiety. Viewed politically, such activity caused internal problems in the projects and weakened the links between COFO and local black communities. It's difficult really to generalize about the impact of the summer volunteers. They did not come down and save Mississippi. Along with other factors, their presence did push the Mississippi movement in a new direction, one that relied increasingly on focusing the national spotlight on the Magnolia State. As for the summer itself, for the most part, as Stokely Carmichael said, the recruits, quote, did just fine. Civil rights scholar Doug McAdam wrote a book about the volunteers. His conclusion that, quote, they were tried and not found wanting applies to the vast majority of the students, clergy, lawyers, and doctors who comprised the volunteer brigade in 1964. Going to move on now to talk in the time I have remaining, on the challenge of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party at the Democrats' National Convention in Atlantic City. This was big news at the time, but I think when we're looking at the legacy of Freedom Summer, why it is worth paying some serious attention to. On July 19th, Bob Moses sent out a memorandum to all COFO project staff members stating that everyone who is not working on freedom schools or community centers must devote all their time to organizing for the convention challenge. COFO had founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in the spring with the intent of challenging the legitimacy of the all-white delegation at the convention. Now time was running out, and the activists went about signing up more party members, saying, look, you don't have to run any risk here. Your names aren't going to be printed in the paper. Just do this. Voter registration had been the heart and soul of the SNCC program in Mississippi for nearly 3 years, but as I said, with a minimal result. Although several thousand blacks had risked their jobs and their dignity to make the trip to the courthouse to take the test, few had succeeded in passing. The test was rigged against them, and the county registrar, often an intimidating presence, alone determined if the applicant had answered the questions correctly. You have registrars with a 5th grade education telling black PhDs that they failed the test. Moreover, the local newspaper published the names of those attempting to register, and that often led to direct economic implications for them. It is not surprising then that the summer volunteers When they went door to door asking people to take the time to go to the courthouse, they very often got rebuffed. But this was going to be different. Now, to mount a successful challenge, FTP needed to demonstrate first that blacks were systematically excluded from participating in the state's party selection of convention delegates. Mississippi chose their delegates through a complicated process that began at the precinct level, where they elected representatives to a county convention, which in turn sent representatives to district meetings, and then finally this smaller group got together in Jackson and elected the 34 delegates and an equal number of alternates. FTP members tried to participate in these regular meetings. They were turned away at the door in all but a few locations. The district and state conventions then were all white, as was the official delegation. To show the tone of the Mississippi Democrats at the time, at the statewide meeting, the white delegates passed a series of resolutions denouncing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, demanding a purge of the U.S. Supreme Court, and calling for, quote, separation of the races in all phases of our society. And almost all the delegates were supporting the Republican presidential nominee, Barry Goldwater. Having been rebuffed by the white party, as they had presumed they would be, FTP set about the task of doing the same thing on their own. Precinct meetings, sharecroppers coming in, naive politically, very quickly adapting to what was going on, district meetings, and then looking forward to the convention in Jackson on August 6th. On the evening of August 4th, Pete Seeger was giving a concert at a black church in Meridian. In the middle of a song, someone came over and whispered in his ear. Seeger stopped singing and spoke to the audience of about 200 local people. He said, "The bodies of Swerter, Goodman, and Cheney have just been discovered. They were buried deep in the earth." The folk singer later recalled that there wasn't any shouting, there's just silence. I saw people's lips moving as though in prayer. A paid informant had revealed to the FBI that the bodies of the three activists were buried under an earthen dam in Neshoba County. Later, Ku Klux Klan informants would reveal that on the evening of June 21st, after the three workers were released from jail, they were again stopped and arrested 10 miles south of town by Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price, who turned the young men over to a mob. The official autopsy showed that all three had been shot, Swerter and Goodman once, Cheney 3 times. The autopsy also stated that there was no evidence of mutilation or bodily injury. The bodies of Swerter and Goodman were returned to New York, where they were buried. The questions remained, and the Medical Committee for Human Rights sent a leading pathologist, Dr. David Spain, to Jackson to examine James Cheney's body. Spain found that Cheney's lower jaw had been shattered and the bones in his right shoulder crushed. Spain's conclusion was quoted in newspapers around the world. Quote, "I could barely believe the destruction to those frail young bones. In my 25 years as a pathologist and medical examiner, I have never seen bones so severely shattered except in tremendously high-speed accidents or airplane crashes. It was obvious to any first-year medical student that this boy had been beaten to a pulp." Late in 1967, shortly after we came to Mississippi, everyone was surprised when an all-white jury in Mississippi convicted 7 men, including Neshoba County Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price and Klan leader Sam Bowers, of the federal crime of violating the rights of these 3 activists. They were not, in the federal case, had to be violation of the rights. All defendants had been released from prison by the mid-1970s. In 2005, an amazing journalist, Jerry Mitchell of the Jackson Clarion-Ledger, his investigative reporting led to the trial and conviction of Edgar Ray Killen, who had orchestrated the Klan killings. Killen was a minister. He was a benefit of a mistrial in 1967 when a single juror said that she would never vote to convict a minister. It took a long time for that to be overturned. For the delegates assembled at the state convention of the FDP on August 6th, the discovery of the three bodies came as a shock, but not as a surprise. They had long since concluded that the young men had been murdered. Now their task at hand was to select a delegation that would challenge the regular state party at the National Convention, and they did so with renewed fervor. 2,500 African Americans and a handful of whites packed the auditorium at the Masonic Temple in Jackson. Each county delegation entered the hall. No other names would be placed in nomination, and there would be no major platform fights. LBJ was riding high in the polls, and the only item of his suspense was his choice of a running mate. There was, of course, no sitting vice president. But the 64 blacks and 4 whites who comprised the delegation of the Freedom Democratic Party threw a monkey wrench into the president's plans for an orchestrated convention. For 4 days, the FDP challenge was the major story of the convention. The delegates arrived in Atlantic City by bus the day before the Conventions Committee hearing. Housed in the small and run-down Gem Motel about a mile from the convention center, they quickly set about their appointed task, fanning out over the convention grounds, buttonholing delegates, bringing them the word on the righteousness of their challenge. While it might appear that the FDP's case was irrefutable, after all, the regular white delegation was not only segregationist, it was not even going to support the national ticket. There was one problem. Lyndon Johnson strongly opposed the Freedom Democrats and their challenge. Now, Johnson knew that his opponent in November would be the nation's leading conservative, Barry Goldwater. Their differences on the issue of civil rights could not be more clear-cut. LBJ had pushed the Civil Rights Act through Congress. Goldwater voted against it. Johnson took pride in his civil rights record. Indeed, no president in history can match it. He opposed the challenge on narrow political grounds, fearing that if this delegation were seated, the other states, southern states, would walk out of the convention and Goldwater would win the election. I really think he believed this, although everybody said that he was nuts to. He told Hubert Humphrey, "There's no justification in messing with the Freedom Party at all. If we messed with a group of Negroes that were elected to nothing and throw out the governor and elected officials of the state, we'll lose 15 states without even campaigning." This is from his secret recordings. Nixon was not the only president to record his conversations. Johnson came obsessed with the challenge, employing 30 undercover FBI agents at the convention, who wiretapped Martin Luther King's hotel telephone and installed microphones surveillance at SNCC headquarters. They even had an FBI agent posing as an NBC reporter to gather intelligence, and this with the cooperation of NBC. Well, unaware that the President of the United States was employing tactics against them normally reserved for gangsters or drug dealers, the FDP went about its business and made its presence known. Supporters set up a round-the-clock vigil on the boardwalk outside the convention hall. There they displayed giant pictures of the martyred civil rights workers and a replica of the burnt-out shell of Mickey Schwerner's station wagon. Freedom songs filled the air, and members of the delegation came by to make speeches. Stokely Carmichael recalled that, quote, "Every delegate going into the arena had to pass our vigil. It was unusually powerful and moving, and many a delegate stopped, looked, listened, and volunteered his vote before going in." When the Credentials Committee convened on Saturday, TV network cameras were there to cover the proceedings. FDP witnesses argued that the convention should seat the delegation because blacks had been set out of the regular party. Moreover, the Freedom Democrats had observed all the regulations in selecting their delegation, pledged their loyalty to the national ticket. But legal arguments would count for little at this meeting. Joe Rao brought forth a number of activists, including Delegation Chair Aaron Henry, National Committeeman White Ed King, Rita Schwerner, Mickey's widow, who was also a dedicated militant activist, and Martin Luther King, who told committee members that, quote, "they must recognize the Freedom Party delegation." Yet that day, even the eloquent symbol of the black freedom struggle was overshadowed by a former sharecropper named Fannie Lou Hamer. The several million Americans watching the hearings on television knew little about Mrs. Hamer, but as she described life on the plantation, her eviction when she registered to vote, and most dramatically, her beating in the Winona jail, it became apparent that hers was an authentic voice describing the daily horror of life in the closed society. This was high drama, and it did not go unnoticed in the White House, where Lyndon Johnson hurriedly called a press conference in the middle of her testimony. The networks dutifully cut away. By the time he had finished, so had Fannie Lou Hamer, but the networks got wise, played her testimony back that night in prime time, where they heard Mrs. Hamer conclude in a voice filled with emotion, "If the Freedom Party is not seated now, I question America." Her testimony was the high point of the challenge, after which the major political developments unfolded backstage. Immediately after she finished speaking, telegrams of support began pouring in, and when the Credentials Committee reconvened on Sunday afternoon, Rao was confident. He had 17 committee members pledged to sign a minority report supporting FDP, 6 more than needed, and 10 states, including the big ones, New York, Michigan, and California, to ensure that there would be a roll call on the convention floor. Now, Lyndon Johnson had become obsessed by the Mississippi Challenge. He doesn't even mention it in his memoir. I went through all of his papers at the Johnson Library, and his diaries were just full of it. And the latest surge of support for the FDP sent him into a tailspin. He told aides that he was going to refuse the nomination for another term because, quote, "I do not believe that I can physically and mentally carry the responsibilities of the world and the Negroes in the South and so forth." Of course, the president changed his mind and then went into attack mode. First, Credentials Committee Chair David Lawrence of Pennsylvania formed a subcommittee to resolve the Mississippi question, appointing as its chair Minnesota Attorney General Walter Mondale, a protege of Hubert Humphrey. It was now an open secret that Humphrey's chances for gaining the vice presidential nomination depended on a solution to the FDP challenge acceptable to the White House. The president's operatives on the floor began contacting members of the Credentials Committee supporting the FDP, promising political rewards or punishment depending on how they voted on Mississippi. The hearings dragged on for 2 more days with no decision on the challenge. With the passage of time, FDP's support on the Credentials Committee began to slip away. Years later, Walter Mondale conceded that, quote, "Frankly, part of what we were doing in our subcommittee was buying time to keep the dispute off the convention floor." The Freedom Democrats were simply not equipped to deal with this raw display of presidential power. Their chief counsel and strategist, Joe Rao, was caught in the middle. He desperately wanted his old friend Hubert Humphrey to become vice president, and Johnson's men took every opportunity to warn Rao that Humphrey's fate was in his hands. All he had to do to ensure Humphrey's nomination, they told him, was to get the Freedom Democrats to listen to reason. Walter Reuther, the powerful head of the United Auto Workers, interrupted negotiation with General Motors to fly to Atlantic City to deliver that message personally to Rao, who was also the UAW chief counsel. At the same time, Joe Rao was committed to the cause of Freedom Democrats, and he wanted to do right by them. Everything came to a head on Tuesday afternoon at the final Credentials Committee meeting. There, Walter Mondale came forward with a 3-part proposal approved by President Johnson. First, FDP representatives Aaron Henry and Ed King would be seated as at-large delegates, with the rest of the delegation, quote, "welcomed as honored guests of this convention." Secondly, only those members of the Mississippi regulars who signed a loyalty oath agreeing to support the party's nominee in November could be seated. Finally, and in the long run most important, the National Democratic Party pledged to eliminate racial discrimination in all future conventions. The combination of political pressure from the White House and the compromise itself all but dissolved FDP's support on the Credentials Committee. There would be no minority report brought to the convention, no roll call vote. The Freedom Democrats met late Tuesday afternoon and rejected the compromise. Later on, Mrs. Hamer would put it dramatically, "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats because all of us is tired." But their response would have no bearing on the final outcome. That night, the convention approved the compromise by voice vote with no discussion. Angry FDP supporters staged a protest outside the convention hall, And later in the evening, 21 members of the delegation, having received credentials from friendly delegates from other states, moved onto the convention floor and occupied the seats of the regulars, but to no avail. For many people, observed SNCC's Joyce Ladner, Atlantic City was the end of innocence. For the radical young activists who had been working in Mississippi for years, the Democratic Convention marked a turning point. Cleveland Sellers expressed their disillusionment with the political establishment. Quote, "Never again were we lulled into believing that our task was exposing injustices so that the good people of America could eliminate them. After Atlantic City, the struggle was not for civil rights, but for liberation." But many of the native Mississippians who comprised the rank and file of the Freedom Democratic Party came away from the Atlantic City with a feeling of some accomplishment. Among them was Delegate Unita Blackwell, who would later be elected mayor of her Mississippi town and to be awarded a MacArthur Genius Grant as well. She said, "Even though we didn't win our challenge, the experience didn't feel like defeat to me," she wrote in her autobiography. "We had, in fact, knocked out most of the regulars from being seated, and we had drawn national attention to our new party and to problems within the National Democratic Organization. We had stood proud and strong." In conclusion, when in the spring of 1964, COFO activists started a plan for the Freedom Summer, they had no idea of the consequences of their actions, or even if they could pull it off. After that summer, the state of Mississippi would never be the same. The Summer Project, grudging compliance with the new Civil Rights Act, and the peaceful desegregation of a handful of elementary schools in the fall of 1964 marked the end of the policy of massive resistance. White Mississippians no longer spoke with a single voice. Segregation remained a fact of life throughout much of the state, but the Jim Crow signs began to come down, and by the late 1960s, it was no longer unusual to see blacks eating in white-owned restaurants, staying in local motels, or patronizing the previously segregated public library. A degree of civility had come to the Magnolia State. The movement had made it possible for the black middle class to make significant gains. By the early 1970s, Mississippi corporations and local governments were employing blacks in positions previously reserved for whites. The major victory of the movement, however, had been the substantial reduction in the use of terror to control the state's black population. Blacks had won the right to organize their communities, to take political action without fear of brutal reprisal. Race violence remained a fact of life, but the systematic use of terror, condoned and often directed by law enforcement officials, gradually abated. Thanks to the Voting Rights Act, now hundreds of thousands of blacks had registered and were voting, and by the 1980s, Mississippi led the nation in the number of black elected officials. Black Mississippians had come a long way since Atlantic City. Not until the 21st century, however, would it be that Americans felt the full impact of the Atlantic City challenge. The Democratic Party's nomination of Barack Obama in 2008 as its presidential standard bearer was an historic event that stemmed directly from the party's pledge in 1964 to abolish racial segregation, discrimination in all state delegations. That action was, in the words of Walter Mondale, the Civil Rights Act for the Democratic Party. In an interview on Inauguration Day 2009, Bob Moses observed that, quote, "The crucial thing about Obama's election was the 1964 challenge of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to the Democratic National Convention. That action, more than anything else, opened up the national party structure." Distinguished civil rights activist Roger Wilkins put it bluntly, "Obama would not be president," he said, quote, "but for the Mississippi Freedom Movement." Despite all the achievements, both locally and nationally, Freedom Summer and the Mississippi movement failed to bring about the social revolution envisioned by the militant activists. Whites today continue to hold most of the positions of political power and to dominate all aspects of economic life. In the second decade of the 21st century, Mississippi still leads the nation in poverty, infant mortality, and illiteracy. Still, if black Mississippians did not achieve all their goals during the movement years, in the decades following World War II, they did bring about extraordinary changes in a state that had been locked up in the caste system for nearly a century. They had transformed the closed society, opened up the political process to African Americans, and made it possible for new generations to build on the solid foundation laid by that band of brothers and sisters who had challenged America during the civil rights years. Bob Moses once observed that the movement had, quote, brought Mississippi, for better or worse, up to the level of the rest of the country. That was no small achievement. It also reminds us of the distance still to be traveled. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dittmer. I thought it would be appropriate to take the first question tonight from Mississippi.
Okay.
So Jim Geeson, class of 1995, who's an associate professor of history at Mississippi State, writes in to say, I want to hear more about the reaction of local black Mississippians in '64 who weren't active in the movement, who were not active in the movement. There must have been a group, a majority even, of African Americans who were not activists and were terrified of what this incursion would mean for them. Could you talk about them?
Thank you, Jim. Student in whom I'm very proud. And he asked a good question. Yeah, there were, and I should have stressed this more, I think, that when it comes to participation in the movement in Mississippi, the number of local blacks who did participate was a very small minority. That for most, the risks were too great, and this was the great triumph of SNCC and COFO to go into a community, and they went into a lot of communities where they just couldn't do anything. People were not interested. But it really took a lot to risk your life, to risk your job, to do it, and the majority did not. For example, Tougaloo College, where we were teaching, was known as a center, a hotbed of civil rights activity, but when we got there, we found out very quickly that it was just a very small percentage of the student body that were active. They could mobilize students around certain things, and this happened in the state as a whole, I think, with things like the Emeritus March, for example. But yeah, by and large, why the majority of African Americans were just too terrified, too trapped in the Jim Crow society to take a stand.
Let's take a question from the live audience here in a moment, but one more online from Jenny Bauer, class of '88, who asks, are you surprised that voting rights are still an issue 50 years after Freedom Summer? And do you see any similarities between Freedom Summer and the recent Moral Mondays and Truthful Tuesdays that have taken place recently in North Carolina and Georgia?
Thank you, Jenny Bauer. Both Jenny and Jim Geeson, by the way, were basketball stars at DePauw, in addition to being outstanding history students. Yeah, the whole question, and this, I don't know if you are familiar with Moral Mondays in North Carolina. This is a movement led by the Reverend William Barber of the NAACP. And this past week they had a rally in Raleigh of 80,000 people, more than 80,000 people, and it really didn't get much publicity outside of North Carolina. But one of the things that they were protesting against was the new voting rights laws, which make it more and more difficult for African Americans to vote because they all have to have a state ID with their picture on it. If this rings true, Indiana was the first state to pass this law. We did not have to face scrutiny because under Title V of the Civil Rights Act, we were not in that group that had pre-clearance, that any law passed had to clear the Justice Department. And of course, that was the part of the Voting Rights Act that was just overturned. So what happened the moment it was overturned is that North Carolina, Texas, and all these states passed these laws that were simply designed to make it more difficult for some people to vote. Now you might ask, well, what's so bad about having an ID? Well, for one thing, it limits the number of people who could get them. I know that in the first election in Indiana, the first people to be turned away from the polls were 4 nuns who didn't have driver's licenses or IDs. DePauw students from out of state who were registered in Indiana could not vote because our ID was not a state ID. IU students from out of state could vote because they had a state ID. Kelsey Kaufman had a wonderful solution here. All these out-of-staters were registered to vote, but if they'd gone to the polls, they wouldn't have been eligible. So she told them all to vote absentee, and they did. There is no recorded example that anybody could cite of voter fraud at the polls. What voter fraud there has been in this country has always been with absentee ballots and the way they're manipulated. And this, of course, has not been touched in any of the laws. In fact, Republicans in the state were advised to vote absentee to avoid all the confusion at the polls. So this is a big setback, and the encouraging thing is that movements are underway to overthrow the one-party government that has in North Carolina and Kansas and Indiana has made it possible for these kinds of measures to be taken. And it goes across the board, whether it's accepting Medicaid, all sorts of restrictions on the right to an abortion. There's a whole sea change of political activity now that is going on in the states. It's ironic that when the Indiana law went up for a federal court, it was upheld 2-1. One of those in the majority was Judge Posner, who in a new book that came out last year said that he didn't think that it would be discriminatory toward blacks, but that he was wrong and that he voted wrong on that case. Well, thanks a lot, Judge.
If anyone has a question here in the live audience, I'll bring the mic to you so that our online attendees can also hear your question.
Hello, my name is Midori, and I'm an international student from Japan. And last semester, I took a class called Rhetoric of the Civil Rights Era by Professor David Worthington, and it was really great. And I was craving to see you because everyone told me I should see you, and I finally got to see you.
You don't look disappointed.
I'm just nervous and to speak in front of online. Okay, and my question was that, well, this was something new to me, the civil rights movement, like segregation and stuff. My first question in that class was, what is the N-word and why can't you use it? And I remember making the whole class silent, and I felt so guilty. And one of my classmates told me that, since I'm white, I can enjoy much more rights than African Americans. Or another classmate told me that American beauty is considered white beauty and not black beauty. And a lot of my friends just told me all this segregation seeming stuff that is still going on. So why is it that people in America tend to have bias against black people, even it's been years since the civil rights movement?
Well, they're just that's a good question, and I think that in raising those questions, why you made people think about things that they probably hadn't thought about for a while. In terms of race and racism in this country, it goes back into slavery, and the legacy of slavery is still just very powerful. If you haven't already, force yourself to go see 12 Years a Slave. I think that more dramatically than anything anybody could say or do talks about how bad it was then, but what the legacy of it is today. I mean, it still goes on. I just learned today that James Meredith desegregated the University of Mississippi in 1962, and a couple years back, why they put up a statue of Meredith on campus. And early this morning, they discovered that somebody had put a noose around the neck of the statue, and the two white guys were shouting racist epithets and the N-word and everything else. So we've come a long way, but boy, we have a long way to go.
Fritz Vandover, class of 98, asks, how did the activities of Freedom Summer ripple among neighboring states around Mississippi and beyond in '64?
Thank you, Fritz. All my history majors are asking questions. I love it. I'll go about that a slightly different way. One of the things that Jim Foreman, who was really the national head of SNCC, wanted to do was to extend Freedom Summer in 1965 into other black belt states like Alabama and Georgia. And there was a big debate in SNCC over whether to do that or not. That did not happen for a number of reasons. One, SNCC people were exhausted after Freedom Summer. You beginning to have the rise of black nationalism, which was a different kind of organizing. You had Stokely Carmichael and others organizing the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which was the first Black Panther Party in Alabama. You had the beginning of the black nationalist sentiment. So the immediate effect, everybody was interested in what was going on in Mississippi, but there were local movements going on in Alabama and Georgia. And although there were attempts in 1965 in Mississippi and other states to bring down another contingent of volunteers, why this did not have nearly the impact that the initial one did.
Hi, Dr. Dittmer. First, I'd like to just thank you for coming out to speak to us today. I really enjoyed your speech. My name is Courtney Cosby, and I am a junior history major from Memphis, Tennessee. And I have two questions for you. The majority of my family is from Jonestown and Clarksdale, Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And what I was just wondering is what impact did the Freedom Summers have on the smaller towns in Mississippi? Was it more so geared to help the larger cities like Jackson? Because just thinking back to stories that I've heard in my family growing up education-wise in Jonestown and in Clarksdale, even today, the education is still very much so at a disadvantage for black people. And my second question...
We'll take one at a time. All
okay,
I can do is remember one thing at a time. Yeah, you mentioned Clarksdale. You should talk to your folks about that. Clarksdale is a very important place because that is where Aaron Henry, who was the state head of the NAACP, had his operation. And in the early 1960s, I didn't have time to talk about it here except to mention it in passing. I mean, Henry and the civil rights forces were boycotting white merchants there. There was a lot of movement activity. He was thrown in jail. His drugstore was bombed. In short, it was a very important part of the movement. The Freedom Vote in 1963 had Aaron as the candidate for governor, and he got more votes in Clarksdale and Coahoma County than he did anywhere else. So it depending on, Ruleville was this tiny hamlet in Mississippi, but Fannie Lou Hamer was from Ruleville. So Ruleville was and is, a major movement town. You could drive through Mississippi towns in the 1970s and it wouldn't take you long to find out which ones had a civil rights movement and which ones, as Jim Geeson suggested, were areas that were relatively unaffected by it. Question number two. Okay.
My second question, you closed out with President Obama, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but to me it seemed that you were saying that Obama being elected president pretty much solved the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So I was just wondering if you felt that the black freedom struggle is over, or does the civil rights movement still continue today?
Ooh, thank you for raising. I'm sorry if I made that. If you got that assumption. No, not by any means. I think this is what is really frustrating to people who are still active in the movement. The idea that we elected a black president, so racism is no longer a problem. And I think that is totally wrong. I think you could go on to say that President Obama has disappointed a lot of his black supporters by not talking about race more and about not doing things in that area. So long after Obama and his administration are gone, we're going to have to be able to have people who are going to address these inherent problems that increasingly have to do with poverty and the inequality of wealth.
The next question is from my DePauw roommate. Thanks for coming out, Dan Roy. He asks, to what extent was the white resistance in Mississippi to civil rights motivated by economics?
The opposition.
The white resistance in Mississippi to civil rights motivated by economics, right?
Yeah, that was, let me give you an example. When the unions came in to try to organize in Mississippi after World War II, why they were for the most part unsuccessful, because whites were saying that the unions were, one, communistic, and they believed in racial equality. So whites, who you could argue were not making any money in the factories, were really voting against their own economic interest when they did not support unions. And it was, and many of the union members were responding in the same segregationist ways as the non-union members. But yeah, it was economically motivated. However, things were changing in Mississippi because in the past, sharecropping was an essential part of the economy. It was the major part of the economy. Mechanization, the mechanical cotton picker, spraying pesticide from the air, all of this made sharecropping irrelevant and outdated. So beginning in the mid-1960s, why the policy of the state government seemed to be, as many blacks as we can get to go to Chicago, fine, because they were no longer needed. They were no longer a valuable part of the economy, when this had not been true 50 years ago. The Great Migration of World War I, throughout the South, blacks were very often taken off of buses and trains simply because they were needed back home.
Many more questions online. Any in the forum here? Okay, I'll go right to Andy Reith, class of 1980, who asks, other than justification on political grounds, how did LBJ reconcile his support for civil rights with his opposition to seating the Freedom Delegation?
LBJ was a complicated person, and I miss him, I mean, when you see what's going on in Washington now, where is LBJ when we really need you? I think more so than John Kennedy. You can argue, I would argue that if Kennedy had lived, he never would have gotten the bill that Johnson got through. He never would have had the passion that I think Johnson honestly felt going back to the time when he was a school teacher in Texas teaching Mexican kids. And the Civil Rights Bill would not have come through nearly as strong or as early without him, the same with the Voting Rights Bill. And he knew the political cost. When he signed the Voting Rights Bill, he talked to his aide, Bill Moyers, and says, we've given the South over to the Republican Party for a generation. But he was also a vain man, an arrogant man. I mean, Johnson wanted to do for the Civil Rights Movement, but he wanted to lead the Civil Rights Movement. He couldn't stand it when Martin Luther King and Freedom Democrats in Mississippi didn't agree with his take on what should be done. And when he got crossed that way, he could be very ruthless, as he was. But I mean, that was this. Atlantic City was not a good time for liberals. The key man in the White House who was receiving all the intelligence from the FBI people on the floor was Bill Moyers, who was passing it on to the president. And I'm hoping that Moyers will write one of my heroes, by the way, will write an autobiography in which he talks about that period. I mean, it was things were happening really fast, and the thing I used to tell my students, the thing in writing history and talking about history is you have to realize that the people who were making the history at the time didn't know how it would end, how it would come out. And I think Johnson honestly believed that his election was more important than having a token delegation from Mississippi seated at the convention.
Dr. Dittmer, you began tonight with a few comments about Bill Allison, so I suppose it's fair to give him an opportunity to have the floor for a moment here.
Thank you, Mr. Allison. Yes.
Yes, he asks, can you tell us what inspired you to take on scholarly work on the civil rights movement, and how has it affected you?
Well, I was born and raised in a small town, Seymour, Indiana, and I was not really aware of much what was going on racially. We were very much a southern town in many respects. The Negro population was on the other side of the tracks. My father was a school teacher with 6 kids, and to supplement the income while he ran the public swimming pool in the summer. And in Seymour, in the last 2 weeks of August, why the pool was drained and refilled, and the Negroes of town then had the pool to themselves. And I remember thinking at the time how nice it was of us to let them use our pool, when, of course, tax money was coming from everybody. So it was a long time. It was gradually, as the civil rights movement unfurled, I became aware of things. And then when I was teaching in Columbus High School, assistant football coach named Ted Marston gave me a New Yorker, which turned out to be the first installment of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, which had a big impact on me. From that point, I wanted to do Negro history. And so I went back to IU, but there was no Negro history at IU. There were no Negro faculty at IU. So I majored in history of the South, and then Ellen and I and our family found our way south in the late 60s. And the interest was just, it was one of the things, it's too long an answer, but those of us doing civil rights history, I think, are a very close-knit group, because we do have a feeling that in a way that we are, although we're not participating in civil rights activity and we're not propagandists, that by getting the story like the one I told you tonight out, that we're helping things along a little.
Maybe one last question from Drew McGregor, class of 1992.
Yes. Hey, Drew.
Are there differences in how the North and South remember Freedom Summer? For example, do we in the North reflect more on the students that traveled to Mississippi, while the South focuses on local heroes? He was reflecting on your statement about the unsung heroes that housed the white students in Mississippi.
Yeah, that was one of the things that began with the Freedom Vote in 1963, that there were all these stories, but they were all about the Yaleys and the Stanford kids coming down. And to an extent, that was true in Freedom Summer as well. All the northern newspapers, wherever there was a volunteer, they would naturally want to cover them. So it was something that it raised a lot of consciousness in the North, raised some money that was sent down south. But in the South, of course, in the black community, why, it was the activists who'd been there for a long time who were the ones who were most honored. For white Southerners, they just saw everybody coming down as the enemy. And a few whites changed their minds, but not that many. They saw them as communists, they saw them as dirty, as beatniks, the whole stereotype. And they knew this when they brought them down, that there would be these kinds of problems. They did not know that the first night in Mississippi that one of the volunteers would be killed.
Thank you, Dr. Dittmer. I hope you all join me in thanking Professor Dittmer for
Thank you all. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Vince. Very much.
I'll just remind all of our alumni tuning in online that our next event in the Virtual Alumni College is March 11th at 8 p.m. with Dr. Sharon Crary speaking on a global public health crisis. So we'll see you then. Thank you.